German soldiers did not enter the final months of the war expecting chaos. They expected rhythm. Their expectations were shaped by years of doctrine and reinforced by experience stretching back to the First World War and through the early campaigns of the Second. Battles had a tempo. Contact was followed by disengagement. Engagements were intense but finite. After fighting came reorganization, counting men, redistributing ammunition, restoring command links. War, as they understood it, moved in pulses. Doctrine taught that even a defeated unit would be granted time. Time to fall back. Time to regroup. Time to establish a new line. Night, above all, was assumed to be protective. Darkness meant concealment. Darkness meant recovery. Units that survived the day expected the night to belong to them. This belief shaped everything. Resistance was organized. Around pauses, rear areas were placed where commanders assumed they would be safe for hours, if not days. Command posts were established close behind the front, confident they would not be overrun before relocation orders arrived. Supply movements were scheduled. For nighttime, when enemy pressure was expected to ease, even retreat followed a familiar script. Rear guards delayed. Main forces withdrew in stages. New positions were prepared while the enemy reorganized. This pattern had held even under Poland, France, Russia, and Italy. Losses had been heavy, but the structure of combat remained recognizable. German soldiers trusted that structure. What they encountered instead was something alien. Patton's forces did not pause when contact ended. They did not disengage at dusk. They did not slow to restore neat lines or wait for orders to ripple down. Columns appeared when no attack was expected. At ours, when German units assumed safety, night no longer brought relief. American armor moved in darkness. Infantry advanced under limited visibility. Recon units slipped past positions that expected silence until dawn. Roadblocks were hit hours earlier than planned. Withdrawal routes were cut before units realized they were threatened. The rhythm was gone. German units attempting to regroup found themselves attacked again before reorganization could begin. Officers trying to re-establish command discovered that the enemy had already moved beyond the last known contact point. Rear areas became front lines without warning. Confusion replaced expectation. Soldiers who believed they had survived the day learned, often abruptly, that the battle had never ended. Fatigue accumulated without release. Ammunition was expended without time to replenish. Orders lagged behind events so quickly that following them became dangerous. The psychological effect was devastating. Men trained to endure bursts of violence, followed by recovery, were forced into continuous pressure. Sleep vanished. Situational awareness collapsed. Units fought, not knowing whether they were facing the main force or merely the edge of something larger. Already behind them, assumptions that had once kept armies functional now betrayed them. Night was no longer concealment. Pauses no longer existed. Retreat no longer guaranteed space. What German soldiers were experiencing was not just defeat, it was disorientation. A war fought without rhythm, without predictability, without the pauses their doctrine required to function. They had prepared for a familiar kind of battle. They were facing something else entirely. And as those outdated expectations collided with relentless movement, resistance began to unravel, not always because positions were overrun, but because the mental framework required to fight had been stripped away. The war they understood had ended. The one they now faced allowed no recovery. The first reports sounded exaggerated. German units began logging enemy contact at ours. That made no sense. After midnight, before dawn, during heavy rain, in conditions that doctrine said should force a halt. At first, commanders assumed these were isolated patrols or probing actions, small elements feeling their way forward. They were wrong. Patton's columns were not pausing. They were not cycling between advance and rest. They were moving as if the concept of halt had been discarded entirely. Armored units rolled through darkness with blackout lights. Motorized infantry followed close behind. Recon elements pushed even farther, never waiting for daylight to confirm what lay ahead. The advance did not breathe. Movement continued through rain that turned roads into mud, through fog that reduced visibility to meters, through exhaustion that should have forced units to stop. When vehicles broke down, they were pushed aside. When crews collapsed, replacements took over. Momentum was treated as a requirement, not an option. For German defenders, this shattered expectation. Units that disengaged at dusk, expecting quiet hours to reorganize, instead found American armor appearing on their flanks before midnight. Rear areas that were meant to be safe overnight became combat zones without warning. Command posts displaced once, then again, often under fire. Reports of contact arrived at all hours. 200, enemy armor sighted on secondary road. 415, American infantry entering village, believed secure. 700, contact never ceased through the night. There was no pattern to exploit. Attempts to reorganize were repeatedly interrupted. Officers trying to reassemble scattered platoons were forced back into combat before orders could be issued. Ammunition redistribution began, then stopped by a renewed attack. Wounded were evacuated under fire, meant for a different phase of the battle entirely. The Germans were fighting a force that refused to respect the clock. Even resistance that might have held during daylight lost meaning when pressure continued without. Poor defensive positions prepared to face a morning assault were bypassed at night. Units rotating off the line found themselves engaged again before reaching rear positions. Fatigue compounded faster than discipline could compensate. The effect was cumulative and corrosive. Soldiers stopped distinguishing between attack and lull because there was no lull. Sleep disappeared. Situational awareness degraded. Men fought while exhausted, unsure whether the enemy in front of them was the main force or merely the edge of something already moving behind them. Firepower alone did not break resistance. The absence of rhythm. With German doctrine relied on pause to function, to re-establish command, to redistribute resources, to restore cohesion. Patton's columns denied those pauses entirely. By the time a unit realized it was under sustained pressure, it was already too late to reorganize effectively. Resistance eroded from the inside. Positions were abandoned, not because they were overrun, but because holding them without relief seemed pointless. Surrenders increased not after decisive engagements, but after nights that never ended. The psychological strain of uninterrupted movement proved more damaging than artillery barrages. 2 German soldiers watching American columns pass through darkness without stopping. The message was unmistakable. This enemy would not wait. This enemy would not pause. This enemy would not allow recovery. The war they had prepared for assumed moments of stillness. Patton's advance erased them, and in doing so, it dismantled resistance long before destruction became necessary. The collapse did not come with a single breakthrough. It came quietly, unevenly, and often without a decisive engagement to mark it. German positions were not always overrun. Many were simply left behind. Units that had fought effectively during the day found themselves unable to continue after nights without rest and days without relief. Exhaustion hollowed out resistance long before ammunition ran dry. Men stopped believing they could hold. Fatigue became the dominant condition. The soldiers slept in minutes, not hours, wherever they fell disguise, doorways, vehicles that might be abandoned by morning. When firing resumed, reactions slowed. Observation failed. Warnings came too late. Positions that might have been defensible were vacated because no one had the strength to reorganize or the confidence that relief would arrive. Command cohesion failed in fragments. Communications broke down, not only from enemy action, but from constant displacement. Headquarters moved repeatedly, sometimes under pressure, sometimes preemptively, often without informing subordinate units in time. Radios went silent. Runners never returned. Maps became guesses. Units lost contact with one another and with higher command almost simultaneously. Orders, when they arrived, were often obsolete. Instructions to hold a village reached units already bypassed. Withdrawal orders referenced. Routes cut hours earlier. Counterattack directives named formations that no longer existed as cohesive entities. The chain of command thinned until it snapped. In this environment, resistance became individual rather than collective. Platoons fought on without knowing where their flanks were. Companies defended intersections, unaware that adjacent units had withdrawn. When American columns appeared from unexpected directions, the shock was less tactical than existential. Isolation spread faster than fear. Small groups began to surrender independently, not after decisive defeats, but after realizing they were alone. A squad would emerge with raised hands after hours of uncertainty. A platoon would surrender to the first American patrol it encountered. unsure whether any friendly units remained nearby. These surrenders were not coordinated, they were symptoms. German soldiers were not calculating odds in the traditional sense. They were responding to the collapse of context. Without communication, without rest, without a sense of front or rear, continued resistance lost meaning. Survival became a personal decision rather than a commanded duty. Momentum did the work. Firepower did not have to. American units did not always need to destroy positions. They flowed past them. They cut roads, seized junctions, appeared behind defenses that had not yet realized they were threatened. The mere presence of movement, constant, unpredictable, unending, undermined the logic of holding ground. 4 German commanders. This was the most alarming development. An army can absorb losses. It can endure defeat. What it cannot survive is the loss of coherence. Once units stop acting as part of a larger whole, strength becomes irrelevant. Numbers cease to matter. Firepower disperses into isolated points with no shared purpose. That is what continuous pressure achieved. The battlefield no longer presented clear lines or phases. It became a series of dissolving pockets, each collapsing at its own pace. Some fought hard to the end. Others faded away without contact. All were shaped by the same condition, relentless momentum that allowed no pause, no reset, no recovery. The decisive weapon was not the tank, the gun, or the aircraft. It was time, or, rather, the denial of it. Patton's advance removed the intervals that armies need to function. Without pauses, doctrine failed. Without pauses, command fractured. Without pauses, endurance itself became impossible. Destruction followed collapse. Not the other way around. By the time many German units recognized defeat, they had not been beaten in battle. They had been worn out of existence. The accounts began to accumulate as prisoners were processed in growing numbers. They came from different units, different regions, different ranks, but the language was strikingly consistent. Interrogators expected to hear about tanks, artillery, air attacks. Instead, they heard something else. They never stopped. Captured soldiers struggled to describe what had defeated them. Many admitted they had not understood they were in a major engagement until it was already over. Contact blurred into movement. Movement blurred into encirclement. What they remembered most clearly was not firepower, but presence. American columns were always there. Prisoners spoke of confusion rather than overwhelming force. Units would make contact in one direction, only to discover Americans appearing from another hours later. Some described firing briefly, disengaging as train, and then running into enemy troops on what they believed was their rear route. Others recounted being bypassed entirely. They would hold a position through the night, hear engines moving in the distance, assume the enemy was repositioning. By morning, they found their flanks gone, roads blocked, command posts silent. Engagement had occurred without a clear beginning. Many reported being outflanked before realizing they were fully engaged. The absence of a clear front was deeply unsettling. Soldiers could not tell where the enemy's main effort lay, if there even was one. Attacks did not come as set-piece assaults. They arrived as sudden proximity. You would see them where they should not be. This uncertainty weighed heavily. Prisoners described exhaustion, not from fighting, but from never knowing when fighting would begin or end. Sleep was repeatedly interrupted. Orders changed constantly or failed to arrive at all. Units dissolved into fragments that moved without coordination, each trying to escape pressure it could not locate precisely. Material losses, they admit, were often secondary. Many surrendered with weapons intact. Ammunition remained. Some vehicles were still operational. What was gone was the belief that organized resistance was possible, the sense that the enemy controlled time and space, that movement itself belonged to the Americans, made continued fighting feel pointless. Several prisoners used the same phrase independently. There was no pause. They described an enemy that advanced through night and weather as if neither mattered. One recalled abandoning a position after dusk, expecting to reform by morning, only to encounter American armor blocking the route before midnight. Another spoke of marching for hours to reach a rally point that no longer existed. The psychological effect eclipsed physical destruction. Men surrendered not because they were surrounded by fire, but because they were surrounded by uncertainty. They did not know where the front was, where their own units were, or how to rejoin them. Each encounter with American troops felt final, not because escape was impossible, but because hope of restoring order was gone. His testimonies revealed something the battlefield reports alone could not. Relentless tempo had shattered resistance at the organizational level. Units were not crushed, they were disoriented. Command was not destroyed, it was rendered irrelevant by speed. The enemy's strength lay not only in weapons, but in denying the Germans the time required to think, plan, and recover from captivity. Stripped of doctrine and obligation, the prisoners spoke plainly. They had not been beaten by a single decisive blow. They had been undone by an enemy that never allowed the war to slow down.